How's it going, everybody? Super glad to be with you on Super Bowl Sunday. I'm calling it now. I think that the Chiefs win by 10. My little boy and I have a bet going on. He thinks the 49ers are going to win. He's a big Brock Purdy fan. If you're not watching this live later on, you'll be able to make fun of me if I get this wrong. Hey, that's not why you're here today. Although we could talk about Taylor Swift and Kelsey and the Chiefs all day, I'm sure. Hey, we're going to talk about the cash flow waterfall. And basically, the reason that we're having this conversation is because one of the most common questions that I get is when it comes to should I invest or pay off debt? So we're going to have that conversation today and using what I call the cash flow waterfall. So let's dive into this and take a peek and have this conversation. So the cash flow waterfall, we're going to talk about investing versus paying off debt, the 10 steps that are involved in this waterfall, and then the rationale, recognizing that personal finance is, in fact, personal. And before we get to that, just want to point out that you can go over to moneymeetsmedicine.com, snag a free copy of my book, The Physician Philosopher's Guide to Personal Finance. If you haven't done that, make sure to share that with friends, family, other medical students, residents, early career attending physicians, and medical professionals, honestly, that you know that might benefit from that. And should you want to or need to get on occupation disability insurance, you can also do that at moneymeetsmedicine.com. We can provide you a quote from all of the 5 own occupation disability insurance companies that exist in this space. So when you need that, happy to be of service there. And that is just a reminder for all the people that might be watching this that are new. So cash flow, right? The idea is pretty simple. You take home a paycheck, you spend some money. What's left is your cash flow. Your cash flow can also kind of be defined in terms of, when you take that big step as an attending, all of a sudden you have a lot more cash flow, or if you get a bonus. We talked about the 10% rule in previous lectures. We'll allude to that here in a minute as well. But basically, this is kind of, when money comes in that is at your disposal before you spend everything, right? So hopefully there's a step that happens before you get to your spending where you consider your paycheck and where this cash flow might be used. Okay, so if you look at the average intern salary, for example, it's $64,000 according to the AAMC at this point in 2024 when this is being recorded. And you think about a $4,000 post-tax paycheck, right? So what's in that $4,000 budget? Well, for a lot of us, right, it's going to include the similar stuff, right? It's going to include your rent or, maybe a mortgage if you own a home. Not something that I recommend while you're in training. Tough to flip a home in 3 to 5 years and know that you're going to break even at least on that. Not going to get into that lecture. Maybe that's a lecture for a future day, but big fan of renting while you're in training. That's not, what everybody does. And I recognize you can have some success there. But, right, you're going to have utilities. You're going to have gas, water. You're going to have transportation. You need to drive a car, get to work. If you don't live in a big city and have, public transportation, in which case your rent or your mortgage is going to be higher, right? You might have childcare. You need to buy your asset protection with its life insurance if you've got dependents, or own occupation disability insurance for basically anyone that practices medicine. Cell phones, student loan payments, right? These are all kind of baked into your budget. And of course, there are budgeting apps that you can use out there. YNAB, you need a budget, good budget, that sort of thing. Mint.com used to be a big one, although they've sold since then. And so budgeting is really important when it comes to this, but I'm not a big budgeter personally. I'm not going to give you a lecture on budgeting because everyone's budgeting is different. It could just be as simple as, for example, an Excel sheet, right? That said, regardless, when it comes to personal finance, your financial goals have to happen first. And then you spend the rest of your money, right? The reason why is because if you don't intentionally plan, then you're not going to get to where you want to go. That might be being financially independent in your 40s or 50s. It's going to look a little different for everybody, but at the same time, you have to take care of your finances first, right? This is a kind of an a priori, the philosophy major in me would call that, you've decided this beforehand, what you're going to do. But we talked about the 2 rules of personal finance and success, right? We talked about 30% rule and the 10% rule and the lecture before this. So if you haven't checked that out, make sure to check it out after. And this idea of the 10% rule, right, is when we have this bump in pay, we become an attending physician, you get a bonus, you come to an inheritance. That is an example of cash flow, right? And so at these moments, we have to consider not only our financial goals, up front, what are we automating? But also when we come into cash flow from these, let's say variable pay periods, what are we going to do with it then? Both of these situations, whether it's your standalone paycheck and what you're going to be doing, off the top, or when you come into money in these situations, that's where we're going to apply this cash flow waterfall, right? So what this does is it automates your financial tasks. It simplifies the process because one of the biggest questions I get, right, is should I invest or should I pay down debt, and in what order, right? So this process that I'm going to teach you today, it is not the only way to do this, right? There are lots of pundits and gurus out there that will teach you, their way to do it. I will say that this will get you to success, right? So if you don't want to think about this anymore, you just want like, hey, Jimmy, just tell me what to do, which I'll be honest is oftentimes what I hear. This process will do that. So some caveats before we get into this 10-step cash flow waterfall. There's some questions this doesn't answer, right? Like it doesn't answer like, should you invest in real estate? That's not what this talk is about. What if I want to keep cash on hand to start a business? If you're saving for, a mortgage for a house, or if you're saving for, a wedding, that sort of thing, that is not really what this is about. The interest rate points that I break this down at, you're going to see is 4 and 8. Yours might be different. You might consider low interest anything less than 5%, or, and high interest anything more than 10 or 12. Obviously, it's going to kind of flux a little bit with the, the current market in terms of interest rates. It's going to flux in terms of, the increased costs of goods, or inflation, as we call it. That said, as a static lecture, general education, apply these principles as you will. I consider things that, are 4% or less to be low interest, things that are greater than 8% to be high interest. You'll see that in this as well. And then obviously, as you're bringing cash flow, don't forget the 10% rule. Your need to live a little bit to enjoy the life that you've created, whether that's your take-home pay or your variable pay, and recognize that not all debt is the same. So I'm going to break out student loans. It's going to be kind of its own separate thing. You'll see that here in a moment. But a lot of people in the medical profession view student loans very differently than they view, a mortgage or, a car debt. All right. So student loans, asset protection. This is supposed to be widened out. I'm not sure why that didn't take over here. Monthly payments, you need to automate those things, just as a reminder. So let's talk about this, right? If we're going to talk about investing versus paying down debt, what kind of debt do you have? Doctors are an interesting lot, right? So, 62% of attending physicians have a mortgage. The one that I find the most interesting on here, this is from the Medscape Wealth report that they put out each year, which I think is really interesting. You should read it, is 1 out of 4 physicians have revolving credit card debt, earn hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and each month they have a credit card that they don't pay off. That's actually higher than it is for those in training. It's 12 to 15% for those that are in training, depending on where you look at the numbers. That said, some people have car loans, some people have mortgages, some people have this credit card debt. They have, school loans. And 80% of people coming out of training, by the way, have student loans. The average being around $210,000, give or take, as of the time of this live. Okay, so we're going to talk about paying down debt. There are a few different systems that we can talk about, and everyone's going to favor a different one, right? So the snowball method, this was made famous, of course, by Dave Ramsey. I'm not a huge Dave Ramsey fan for a variety of reasons. I don't think the advice is great for high income earning professionals. That said, this does work for one reason, which is psychology, right? So the idea here is that you make, your monthly payments, so your minimum payments on all of your debt. And then you take your smallest debt. So let's say you have a debt of, $1,000 credit card, and then you have a $10,000 car, and then you have a $300,000 student loan. It doesn't matter which one of these have the highest interest. What matters is the smallest. And so you take any extra cash that you have, you pay off that credit card, for example, and then you might pay off the car next, even if the car is, 3% interest and the student loans are 6.8. They don't, Dave doesn't really care about the interest rate in these situations. The reason why is because once you pay this off, you then roll it like a snowball into the next one. And it's beneficial from a psychological perspective, right? This is not going to win based on math. You are going to pay more money overall by doing this method. But what it does do is helps you build those financial muscles. There's nothing wrong with this method if that's the one you choose. The second one is Avalanche, right? So this is just straight math, right? You take the one with the highest interest rate, you make all your minimum payments, and then that's, that credit card's going first because 20% APR, and then maybe your 6.8% student loans, and then you're going to pay off the auto debt that's 3%, right? So this is going to go just directly in the order of the interest rates that you have. This is going to win mathematically every time over every other system. And the reason why is because you're paying it based on the interest rates. So if you're just a cold-hearted logician, you're a robot, and this is, you're going to stick to your plan, this one is going to win. Okay. But most people that I know are not, right? They are not robots. So I employ something called the snowplow method, which is basically the avalanche method with a little bit of psychology, predominantly around student loans. And the reason why is because most people that I know view student loans very, very different psychologically than their other debt. So I call this the snowplow method. So when we apply this, we get to our 10-step cash flow waterfall, right? And in this 10-step cash flow waterfall, you're going to notice there are a few steps. We're going to have one lecture this week. We're actually not going to have a lecture next week. I'm out of town. My little girl has a all district band thing, so we're going to go support her. But then the week after that, we'll finish the second half of the 10-step cash flow waterfall. Okay, and so these first 6 steps, right? So you're talking about beginning an emergency fund. We'll finish it later. Match, high interest debt, charitable giving goal, max out your 401k. So we're going to talk about that in turn. Again, interest rate breaks points. This is how I break them down. Yours might be different. You might think, 5 to 10. Either way, the principle applies, and this will get you to your goal. So the first 3 steps, we're going to build a deductible emergency fund, 401k match, and then high interest debt. And so we'll talk about why here in a second. The deductible emergency fund, the reason this is the first step in the cash flow waterfall is because psychology, right? So the same reason that the snowball principle works for those that follow that method, building an emergency fund that's just something like, let's say your highest deductible is $1,000. I think this is a really good number, by the way, if you're in residency to have for an emergency fund. But even if it's not, let's say you just haven't ever saved money, getting that first $1,000 into a bank account is a win, right? Like you're proving to yourself that you can do that. And so you're building those financial muscles, which is why this is a great first step when it comes to the 10-step cash flow waterfall. This is purely and specifically a psychological, let's build our financial muscles and prove that we can do the other 9 steps on this thing by saving some money and showing to ourselves that we can do that. The next step is the match. The rest of these you're going to find go specifically in order of the interest rate in which you're going to be able to get money and or pay it off. And so this is an interest rate thing, right? So the match, if we were in a lecture and I could pop you on the camera and ask you what this is, and maybe as you're watching this, you might toss it in the chat box. But the match is when you put in $1, right? Your employer is going to match $1. So said differently, this is 100% return on your money. Nowhere else in personal finance are you going to get a 100% doubling of your money immediately when you put it in. Okay. That's why after the psychological win of the deductible emergency fund, this is the very first thing that you should do. You should never skip your match. I don't care if you told me you have $50,000 and 20% credit card debt. That 20% is still less than 100%, which is the return that you're getting on your match. Okay. I hate credit cards. I think they're terrible. You'll find out here in a second that, what my views are on that and why, but you should never bypass your match. One thing that I do want to mention here, even though this isn't an investing lecture, is something called vesting. Okay. This is important for those that are in training listening to this. Maybe, you're a family medicine resident. You're like, oh, well, Jimmy told me that I should never skip my match. And so I'm going to put money into my employer's 403B and, and because I'm gonna get 100% return on my money. Well, and then you find out when you're leaving that they had a 4-year vesting period, for example. You went to a 3-year family medicine residency. What vesting means is how long do you need to stay at your employer in order for that matching dollar to become yours? Okay. So if it's a 4-year vesting period and you're in a 3-year residency, you are not going to be there long enough to keep it. So they're going to say, actually, we're taking back our money. You didn't work for us for long enough. So when you look into a match, make sure, right, that this is something that you're going to actually get to keep. It's called vesting. Just check into it. HR, wherever you work, should be able to answer that for you. Okay. The next one is paying off high interest debt, right? So this is debt that's above 8%. And so, when you think about, let me get myself out of the way there, 8% interest debt, some examples, right? You might have a personal loan, right? You might have credit cards. Some people might have a really bad deal on a car, right? And maybe your credit's in a bad spot, tough spot because of, your background and, the tough things you've gone through. 8% or more, in my opinion, is what I would call high interest debt. Now, if you're paying attention, right, I have recommended that you do this before creating a real emergency fund, that 3 to 6 month emergency fund that most people recommend. Why would I do that? Well, the reason why is because this kind of debt is a financial emergency, right? If you have credit card debt, pay it off. Your APR is 20, 25%. Maybe you have one of the special deals where it's 0%. Of course, you're going based on the interest rate. I wouldn't tell you to do that right now. That said, let's say that you come across an emergency, and what are you going to do? You're going to toss it back onto a credit card if you don't have an emergency fund. So might as well pay off the credit card, which is a financial emergency, first order, right? So we've got 100% match on our match, or doubling immediately. You got 25% credit card. Guess what? That interest rate's probably higher than pretty much everything else that you have. Pay it off. Once you do, that's when you start getting to the rest of this stuff, right? So the real deal emergency fund, the charitable giving goal, your 401k. And so why have an emergency fund, right? If we're going to do this, have this conversation, why should we have an emergency fund? I know there are a lot of doctors out there who will say, hey, or medical professionals, I'm married to a high income earning person. I don't need an emergency fund because if I got hurt, we would just depend on their income. I make a lot of money. I know it's coming in every month. I live on less than what I earn. So I don't need an emergency fund, right? And so, for those of you who are watching, right, there are a few here. What are some reasons that you might need to have an emergency fund that's more than $1,000? Let's say that you're going to have an emergency fund that's for 3 to 6 months. What are some things? Toss them in the chat box. What are some things that could come up, right, that would require you to have an emergency fund? I think this is a helpful exercise because there's a lot of things that people don't consider when they do this, right? So we got a car breaking down, right? And actually 2 people popped that up immediately. Great stuff, right? What else? What are some other things? I bet there's one that you're not going to think of, and that is a great reason, right? Okay, yeah. So you got a home repair. Yeah, a new furnace, new roof, right? So good. Water heater breaks, right? So we're thinking about cars and houses predominantly. All right, let's say that maybe you have like a medical emergency, right? You have something come up, in terms of unexpected medical expense because, you broke your arm or you ended up having appendicitis and had to have surgery. All right, there's a variety of things that can come up, but there's also some other things that could come up, right? And these are the stuff that a lot of people don't think about, right? Some people think about this stuff. What if you get disabled, right? So we talk about own occupation disability insurance a lot. For those of you that know my story, you recognize that, I got hosed by an insurance agent when I was a 4th-year medical student. I can't get own occupation disability insurance, which is why it's so important to me that never happens to someone else. I think it's the number one financial task for doctors because this cash flow waterfall, investing, paying off debt, completely pointless if you lose your income, right? What happens if you become disabled? Well, there's something called an elimination period, okay? So when I say disabled, elimination period. This means how long do I have to wait before my disability insurance kicks in? For most people, this is going to be 60 to 90 days. For some people, they've extended it to 180 to lower how much their disability insurance costs each month. But either way, most people have about a 90-day elimination period. And so that's why I will say for the vast majority of doctors, you need to have 3 months of living expenses, right? And so this is the common, let's say recommendations, advice in this space is 3 to 6 months of living expenses. So you take all of those things that you could live on for your basic needs, right? So in this situation, I'm going to get rid of my kids' $529 that I save for each month. I'm going to get rid of, to be honest with you, my tithing that we're going to talk about this month. I'm going to get rid of, any extraneous expenses. How much money would I absolutely have to have in order to, pay my mortgage, to pay any auto loans that I might have, to pay, for my kids, for food, for groceries, for my utilities. How much would I need? I'm going to multiply that by 3 to 6. And the reason why doctors in particular should do this is because of the elimination on your own occupation disability insurance. You need to cover that period before that disability insurance kicks in. Okay. So you don't have to just follow the advice that typical people are given just because that's what people say you should do. Instead, you should plan for your specific personal finance situation and know how long your elimination period is on your disability insurance. If you're not sure, go read your policy. Send it to us, right? You can send it to my buddy Michael at moneymeetsmedicine.com. Mike's happy to take a look at your insurance policy, figure that out for you, let you know if it's up to snuff. But either way, you need to have enough money to cover that expense, okay? So talked about this, 3 to 6 months, common education. But how do you actually know that number? I think 3 to 6 months based on what your elimination period is a good situation, right? Because people talk about cash flow. I don't need this. What if you're an eat what you kill model, right? You're in a strictly RVU production model. Let's say a vascular surgeon. I know someone watching this right now is a vascular surgeon watching live. Appreciate you being here, by the way. And all of a sudden, right, you get hurt, you can't work. The pandemic happens. Like, let's say you lose a contract at a hospital, you're not covering as many sites. That cash flow that you thought was coming in through your eat what you kill model is now gone, right? That's another example of a situation you might need. So risk tolerance, everybody's different. I got a buddy, one of my best friends, who has double the emergency fund that I have, even though our living expenses are pretty comparable. That's because he's more risk averse than I am. Okay. So personally, I try to keep about $40,000 to $50,000 in an emergency fund that would cover about 4 to 6 months for my family. Maybe more if we really kind of cut things down. Your number may be different. Your number when you're in training might be $1,000, right? You might stop at that first emergency fund because honestly, $1,000 to $2,000 in training, like you've done really, really well for yourself. You should be proud of that. I personally did not have that. I didn't know anything about money back then, but even if I did, like that's a tough number to get to in training. So you don't need to like blow this thing out of the water. If you're able to, great. You get to this part of the waterfall, fantastic. Save 3 to 6 months. Okay. The next step, and I believe in this step kind of happening after you have that emergency fund, because I think it's important to kind of give from, a position of strength. Everybody's different. Naturally, some people are going to have, charitable goals that are aligned with missions or purposes that they really believe in. For some people, this is going to have religious background, but either way, it's really, really interesting that, this give to charity thing, which has been backed by, thousands of years of religious teaching, has now actually come into psychological studies and behavioral finance studies. And it's been shown as one of the few things you can do with your money to actually increase your life satisfaction. And so I think, regardless of, your religious opinion, based on the studies that are outside of that in secular, studies on behavioral finance, you're encouraged to do that. Oh, and by the way, the government gives you a tax break when you give to charity, right? So I think this is something that's worth your consideration. Everybody's different. You might decide to give your time or your resources or your passions. You may also decide to give some of your financial, abilities to other people. This is the spot in the waterfall where I'd encourage you to do it. You already built your emergency fund, so you're not going to be in the position of needing charity yourself, at least for 3 to 6 months. And now we can give to other people and things that we believe in. Okay. The last step that we're going to talk about today is maxing out your 401k. My face is in the way. If you're in residency, this means your Roth IRA. Okay. Now, the reason that I would have you do a Roth IRA after doing your matching, right, is because of your tax situation. We're not going to dive into that in this talk, but let's just say, for the sake of alliteration or for mnemonics, you want to favor pre-tax, right, in your peak earning years. And you want to favor, so P&P, right, Roth in residency. And the reason for that is your tax burden is lower when you're in training. It's potentially going to be higher when you're retired. So you'd rather take the tax hit now. That said, you can put about $6,500 per spouse if you're married into this thing, right? If you're going to be an attending physician, this is where you would max out your 401k if that's available to you. And this is when you would do that in the cash flow waterfall. If you do the Roth IRA, you do have to have an earned income. If your spouse doesn't have an earned income, you can still put money in for them. That's fine, but one of you has to have earned income. And Roth, of course, means post-tax contributions. We'll talk about that in an investing lecture series in the future. Okay, so what we're going to talk about, not next week because my daughter has her band thing, is paying off student loans, medium interest debt, meeting your annual savings goal, and then paying off low interest debt. And we'll do that in the following lecture 2 weeks from now. Also super excited. Great. I love it. We have a question in the chat box. I'll answer that in a second. If you have any other questions, please toss them in the chat box. Always happy to answer. The following week, after we finish the cash flow waterfall, we're going to start doing student loan case studies. I'm actually really excited about this. So I've had people from the audience send in their situations. We've already had, a couple dozen do that. And so we're going to do case studies for a little while, if it's helpful for people, and kind of go through how to sort through your specific student loan situation And I'm going to show you the numbers. I'm going to show you the math, how to think through it. And so hopefully as we go through these situations, you can apply them to your situation, lead to some good conversations and discussions on student loans specifically. But again, there will be no lecture next week. So if you're watching this recording, you're not going to notice, but if you come live, which I appreciate, makes this much better, then it will not be happening. So in the chat box, got a question on, should you still do Roth in residency if in PSLF? So that's actually a fantastic question, right? So let me go back to this because I've got a little bit of room to write on this thing here. So if you're in training, it's a really good question, right? Because the way the student loans work is that they're based on discretionary income. And if I ever misspell something, just feel good because I can't spell. It's a thing. I'm never gonna be able to fix it. So, which is your adjusted gross income, right? So it's usually a percentage. So in say, for example, it's 5 to 10% of your adjusted gross income minus 225% of the poverty line. The reason that this question matters is because of your adjusted gross income. You can look at the Schedule A and find out what are the things that you can deduct that will lower your adjusted gross income. One of them happens to be pre-tax contributions to a 401k, for example. And so let's say that this resident had a $64,000 salary. Let's say that they're single and the poverty line, which I don't know off the top of my head, but let's say it's 20 grand, right? Now they're looking at an AGI of $44,000. But let's say that they had some money and they decided that they wanted to put $6,000 into a 401k that their employer provides. Well, guess what? Now they are having an AGI of $38,000. Now we're going to subtract, the poverty line here, right? This has already happened, but theoretically, really, really rough math. If they're going to contribute $6,000 a year, this math doesn't exactly pan out, but just take the principle with you. And their payments are based on 10% of that, right? Well, they've just saved themselves, a good $500 per month, potentially, right? Now, again, the math doesn't shake out like that. We'll go through the individual cases, show you the math in the future. But the reason that this is a really good question from Jackson is that the pre-tax contribution does lower your adjusted gross income, which is part of the calculation to determine your student loan payments. And so there are a lot of really, really reasonable ideas out there about putting your money in pre-tax if you're pursuing PSLF, and not even PSLF, if you're in an income-driven repayment program, because it will lower your monthly payment. I love that idea. I think it's great. It's fantastic. If you want to do that and lower your student loan payment, really, really good idea. In your first 2 years in training, though, probably not what you want to do. And the reason why, and this isn't for everybody, we're going to go through all these case studies, show you all of these different scenarios. But let's say if you're a single resident, right? SAVE is going to be the right plan 99% of the time. That'll probably be the first case study that we do. And that is going to be based on your fourth year med student income, which for the vast majority of people is $0, right? And so your payment is going to be 10% times zero, right? So it's going to be zero. Your payment during your intern year is going to be $0. So when you contribute pre-tax money into your 401k, when your payment's zero, like it's not like you get money back. Your payment's still just going to be zero, right? So in your first and second year, when your payments are pretty low, particularly if you're single, Roth money makes a lot of sense in that situation because of the tax, situation. You're going to pay lower taxes now than you will likely. Now, I can't predict the future, but likely in retirement. So for that reason, in your first couple of years, Roth makes a lot of sense for residents. As you get further along, contributing pre-tax will lower your monthly payment and allow you to have a lower monthly payment for your student loans. So that's a fantastic question. All right. Any other questions in the chat box people want to toss in there? Okay, we got one more. And keep tossing them in there. I'll stick around for as long as we have questions. So Brian asked, you can call me Jimmy, by the way. I don't bite, I promise. No one calls me Dr. Turner except for patients. What are your thoughts on consolidation for fourth year med students? Great idea, right? So what consolidation allows you to do as more importantly, as an intern, you can't really consolidate when you're in training and get into an income-driven repayment program. But when July hits and you consolidate your loans, what that allows you to do is skip what's called the grace period. This is really important because, again, those payments are probably based on a $0 income as a fourth-year medical student, which means your payments are going to be zero. But yet those $0 payments still count for public service loan forgiveness. So because of that, consolidating so that you can enroll in an income-driven repayment program, get those lowest payments. And even if they're, let's say that you're married, you have some income, and those payments are $200 a month. Well, guess what? If you can get 4 or 6 of those, payments in by consolidating, skipping that grace period, right? Otherwise, for 6 months, you don't make any payments, which means you don't get those monthly payments counting towards PSLF. The payments that you're adding are on the back end when you're an attending physician, and that is those are the most expensive payments that you're going to have, right? So you might be trading $0 payments on the front end for $2,000, $3,000 monthly payments on the back end, right? So by not consolidating and enrolling in an income-driven repayment program, you could be, basically committing a $10,000, $15,000 mistake, right? That said, if you are in a non-traditional situation, anytime you consolidate your loans after July, unfortunately, the waivers have, passed to my knowledge. Those don't consolidate your loans and then all count all of the payments that you've had in the past. And so if you've made payments on your undergraduate debt, for example, before you started medical school, you don't want to consolidate those loans because it'll reset the count on the loans that you've already started paying that would count towards public service loan forgiveness. For most people that have gone straight through high school, college, med school, right? You're not going to be in that situation. Consolidate your loans because you've never made a payment on any of them. If you have made payments that qualify for PSLF in the past, then you just need to be kind of aware of that. So yeah, the follow-up question was, allows you to skip the grace period. The only thing is we would not be able to tackle high debt versus low debt in the way you described, since it will be one loan. So I guess I'm trying to figure out which is the best financial decision. So you're going to make your minimum payments on everything, right? Like, it's not like just because student loans, and we'll talk about this, not next week, the week after that. Student loans have a special place in the heart of people if they're going to pay them back themselves. One caveat I'll make in that lecture is that if you're doing public service loan forgiveness, your goal is to pay the minimum payment and the lowest payment you could possibly, pay and have your debt forgiven. So because of that, right, you're just going to make a minimum payment. That student loan spot, that number, I think it's number 7 or 8, is just going to go away, right? Or number 6, it's just going to go away, right? Because you're just making your minimum payment and then you're not thinking about it anymore. That's one of your automated payments, right? If you decide that you're going to pay it back yourself because you have a low amount of debt, your debt to income ratio is not very high, that is when you would have student loans in the cash flow waterfall. But otherwise, you're just going to make your payment on your student loans, and then the cash flow waterfall comes into place after your automated payments you've made, and then you tackle debt in the high to low interest order in which it's laid out in there. But you're always going to make your student loan payment, right? Super, super important to do that. And so that would be top of the list, because you got to automate those payments first. You got to pay for your mortgage. You got to pay for your student loans. You don't have a choice. They will put you in the standard repayment plan, and you will be paying a very expensive bill if you don't do that. Don't recommend it. All right. Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to answer questions. And if you have other questions, I'm happy to answer. You can shoot me an email, jimmy@moneymeetsmedicine.com. And I can bring those to show. And even if we get enough questions at some point, we could do a Q&A show itself. And just kind of bounce ideas. And Brian is saying, go Wake. I will echo that. Go Deeks. Play Duke on Monday. Hope we destroy them. I'm a big Wake Forest fan, as you can see. Where is it? Right there. Wake Forest. All right, everybody. I'll see you in a couple weeks. Let me know if you have questions. If I can help you in any way, Jimmy@moneymeetsmedicine.com. Always happy to help. Otherwise, I will see you in a couple weeks. Cheers.